All right, so hello everyone and a warm welcome to our webinar titled Reconnecting Communities with ArcGIS Urban, where we'll take a look at some more advanced topics in urban. And we'll do this with a backdrop of remediating the effects of urban highways that have existed across many North American cities. We're going to take a closer look at how scenario planning can help us look back at what could have been and experiment with what still could be in the future. Today, we're also going to take a deep dive into configuring metrics in ArcGIS Urban to give you a sense of how to construct your own development feasibility model. So let's dive right in. Firstly, my name is Brooks Patrick. I'm the Global Sales Manager for the Smart Cities team at Esri, focused on urban development and planning technologies. I will guide you through this presentation together with my colleague, Robin. Robin, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks Brooks. Hi everyone, my name is Robin Franke and I am an account executive on the Smart Cities Solutions team here at Esri. I support ArcGIS Urban for the West Coast and Asia Pacific, and I also have a background in urban planning and GIS.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so as mentioned, first Robin will help set the stage by covering the important through line of today's topic, the emergence of urban highways. I will then take you through a short introduction to how urban can be used to sketch out and test different scenarios, then a deep dive into building out metrics in urban to evaluate development feasibility. And to do this, we will take into account both city metrics as well as developer metrics and try and build these into a single impact model. And finally, you won't want to miss the last part of the webinar, which is how to get started. We'll actually give you a link to the example that we're showing today, and either with a free trial of ArcGIS Urban or with a license that you already have, you can log in and try it out yourself. Now I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Robin, to take us through our first part, the emergence of urban highways.
Thanks, Brooks. So before talking about how to fix our fragmented communities, let's first start with a small background on how they got to the state they're currently in. Most planners today would look at this photo and be disgusted but in 1939, highways were seen as the future of a city. The paths of these highways were laid out in the late 1940s and 1950s in what was referred to as the Yellow Book, which specified the paths these highways would take through major city centers. The plan's key contributors, to no one's surprise, were members of the automotive industry and highway engineers. Urban planners were absent, as that wasn't even really a profession at the time. The result of these plans has led to a long and shameful history of constructing highways through, almost exclusively, low-income neighborhoods populated by people of color. Often these projects were framed as a revitalization effort, but only further exacerbated the already difficult situation communities faced on a daily basis. And once a highway project was approved, very little could be done to stop it. Highways themselves have many negative impacts on a community, from being expensive to maintain, to reducing taxable land for the jurisdiction, to increasing traffic on surface streets at the pedestrian's expense. These highways created in the 20th century made US cities more car-centric, while also ruining the lives of many. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was established in 1933 by the US Congress to refinance mortgages in default and prevent foreclosures. In 1935, they created residential security maps for 239 cities in the country to indicate the level of security for real estate investments. The maps were graded so the newest areas, which were considered the most desirable for lending, received a type A grade. These areas were primarily white, wealthy suburbs. Still desirable neighborhoods were given a type B grade, older neighborhoods were given a type C grade, and lastly, type D neighborhoods, shown in red, were regarded as most risky for mortgage lending. This coined the term redlining. And this explicitly targeted African American business and other communities of color. Overlaid on a map, we can see how the city of Oakland was graded according to the HOLC guidelines. Now, if we add in textured mesh, we get a better idea of how history has shaped Oakland's demographics and urban form as we know them today. This mesh was provided by Esri's business partner, Nearmap. And by adding the current street network, we can see how the highway has completely disrupted the city center and existing connectivity. Ultimately, we can see how the highways were built in areas that were deemed less desirable, further disconnecting them from their neighbors. In today's webinar, we are going to explore a site in the city of Oakland that has been disrupted by the 880 highway. This was also the site that was used for the recent Urban Land Institute Hines competition, and we'll be focusing on this area to demonstrate how we can use tools like ArcGIS Urban to understand what could have been if the highway didn't disturb the connection between Oakland City Center and the surrounding neighborhood. Today, a new federal policy, the Reconnecting Communities program, fund planning to address the past transportation decisions that fractured, displaced, and segregated communities. The program seeks to deploy new federal transportation equity programs and resources into local plans and projects to support communities negatively affected by past infrastructure decisions. Metropolitan planning organizations will see an influx of direct financial support with a 32% increase in funding for transportation planning compared to 2020. And regional and local planners will also have access to a new $500 million grant program for smart city technologies like the ones we'll talk about today. In addition, the President's Economic Council is looking to implement further changes like this. They've called for a $5 billion grant program to fund communities that abolish restrictive zoning codes. This new program would enable planners to modernize development codes, overhaul exclusionary zoning, and engage with the community on proposed reforms. Nearly every part of the US has that walkable mixed-use place. You know, that Main Street feeling, so we don't have to really invent this from scratch, right? We just have to plan and make local development decisions like we used to do. Next slide, please. So ArcGIS Urban is a wonderful tool to help implement smart city technology into your planning workflows. I'm going to now hand it over to my colleague Brooks to talk about how ArcGIS Urban can be used to develop scenarios for rebuilding and reconnecting our communities.
Thanks a lot, Robin. So now I'm going to jump into a demonstration of how we might use ArcGIS Urban to reconstruct the urban fabric around the site in Oakland. As Robin mentioned, the site's along the Highway 880 in Oakland, and it was actually the site of the recent ULI Hines competition. Together with our partner Nearmap, we recently partnered with the Urban Land Institute to bring some of this new data and new tools to the competition itself, like the 3D mesh shown here today. We're looking forward to seeing the results of the competition, and they should be published and released later this month, so you too can also take a look by going to uli.org/Hines. There's also a lot of nice resource videos there as well. So also keep in mind that while we're working on a real site in a real city, the example is not necessarily reflective of any views by the city or any local agency. This is really a technical demonstration today. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. So as mentioned a bit earlier in the webinar, Robin will provide a link to Urban and just make sure you're signed in. Once you hit that link, an example will open, and the first thing you'll need to do is save a duplicate of that. You can do this by clicking on the name next to the small lock icon and give your copy a name, something unique to you. And once you're done, you can click OK, and it should take around 2 to 3 minutes to make the copy. So be patient. You can leave the tab open while you wait. Once your own copy is ready, you can open it up. You can also take that same copy and share it with other colleagues that also might want to try out this example that we're going to be going through. You can do that also by going up to the configure and then going to the sharing tab. And just to demonstrate this very quickly, I can start sharing it by just typing the usernames of others in my organization, same as you would do yours. So I can add Robin, and I can also add our colleague Kira. And when you're finished, you hit share, and now they'll have access to that same copy, and you guys can edit it all together as one team, essentially. And one of the first things you'll want to do is probably bookmark that page and also keep that URL handy to go back. So there are many local layers that have been added to the context of this plan. This includes details relating to zoning regulations that can be found per parcel. You turn off and on the context layers in this menu. And in addition, you can switch base maps when needed. First, this example will use the imagery base map. One thing to keep in mind is that when using a mesh as your imagery base map, not all the parts of the building are suppressed that you'd want to have suppressed. You can see that here in the example where the building edge doesn't exactly line up with the parcel that was used to demolish it, but it's an easy fix. You draw a small polygon over the part that still needs to be demolished, and that usually fixes it pretty easily. All right, so now that I have a parcel here in the example that's fully demolished, I can start building up a design. I will increase the speed a bit, but what you will see is how to use the editing tools to draw new space use on the parcel. We've prepared a handful of example space use types, residential, retail, office, parking, and amenities. You can always create your own, which was covered in more detail in a couple of other webinars we've done. But for this example here, we can model 2 towers, one office tower and one residential tower. And between, we can use a surface space use type to delineate a park, for example. You can also switch to the underground base map and draw looking up. I know it can be a little strange for anyone not used to drawing this way, but it allows you to add in underground parking, for example. If any of the spaces clash with each other, you can also move the entire building, adjusting the elevation or position of that overall structure. So each of these space use types that we're drawing have parameters set up. Please make sure you go in and you edit these to reflect your local conditions if you end up using this example in a different location for a different planning effort. These parameters drive downstream metrics that we're going to cover in more detail in the second half of today's webinar. So the dashboard allows you to look at overall performance of the scenario, and they too can be customized as needed. One very useful thing to know is that you can also take everything that's shown in the dashboard and download those metrics to Excel. This is useful if you have a pro forma that's being built there in Excel and you want to be able to take one or all the scenarios, which show here as separate columns, and bring those into an existing pro forma. The export can also be filtered by just a selection of parcels, but generally you can get everything out as one Excel file. So as you create scenarios, you can also analyze other impacts like on shadow or visibility. So similar to how metrics give you a quick look at quantitative performance, we can also look at the spatial performance of the scenario. For example, you might consider that certain units have good visibility to the park nearby, therefore considered for higher rent, or you want to make sure that the shadow doesn't cast too much on some residential units, for example, that might be during a certain time of day. So one thing to note as well is you can create as many scenarios as you need. So we have 2 here that we're going to create. So the first one you saw me create, but one useful thing is to take and create a copy of a scenario as the next scenario. So here we're going to take scenario 2 as a copy and then modify it a bit. In this case, we can make the residential tower here maybe block the highway noise a bit better and shelter that park that's in between the 2 buildings. So when you switch between 2 different scenarios, the dashboard relates to which scenario is active. So you can check how changes to the design might actually improve the metrics at the end of the day. So with this, I'm going to actually stop the kind of general introduction to Urban. This is hopefully giving you a chance to kind of see what this is about. I'm going to now zoom out and kind of scale this up a bit. So as Robin mentioned in the introduction, many urban highways have hurt cities both financially and physically, making it incredibly difficult to rebuild neighborhoods. I'm going to start this conceptual plan by reconstructing the historic blocks that would have run along that highway corridor in Oakland. So highway removal, it can knit neighborhoods back together, revitalize the downtown cores, free up land for redevelopment, for new businesses, affordable housing. And at the end of the day, it can result in an increased tax revenue to the city. Some recent projects that you might be aware of are the elevated highways that were knocked down, such as Harbor Drive in Portland, which became a park, or Alaska Way Viaduct in Seattle. Both have resulted in new downtown investment. So now, with the best of my design ability, I will utilize Urban's sketching tools and the underlying space use types that we've established in order to mock up a potential scenario across this corridor. So keep in mind, this is a technical demonstration, and I thought it would be helpful for you to see the entire process in a sped up way. This is going far beyond even the initial scope of the ULI Heinz competition this year. But at the end of the day, urban land is extremely valuable, and creating more of it where it didn't exist before is like urbanist magic. With removals or capping, improvements can be made to the overall connectivity across what would usually be a barrier. So in this scenario, I'll also enlarge Jefferson Park. Usually additional downtown green space means more habitat, less heat island effect, boosting surrounding property values at the same time. So as I play back my design time at high speed, you can see how a simple tool for sketching a building or two on a single parcel can scale up to entirely reimagine a downtown without, in this case, Highway 880. You can also see I've chosen a couple housing opportunity sites around the surrounding neighborhoods to test how the larger scheme would fit in. So at the end of the day, this example took me about an hour to sketch out. The final scenario, as you can see, offers better connections across the study area. And we can further evaluate designs using the dashboard in Urban. So the dashboard itself is fully customizable, meaning that the metrics themselves, but also the underlying values that might be used to localize the size of a residential unit, for example, or the cost of one, or the value, other factors, all of this can be localized. So I'm going to now transition and get into this a bit more. Yeah, so it's critical to treat the underlying evaluation model for a plan as you would basically physical scenarios. You can build out both the physical scenarios, but also in the metrics themselves, tweaks to the underlying factors can actually give you the ability to test different underlying factors that relate to that plan without necessarily changing the overall physical nature of the plan. So what we're going to be doing now is look at how metrics can be created in Urban, and also how these can relate back to a larger development feasibility model. So first, the example we'll use today is the same one seen in the demo so far. We wanted to take into account the overall space use program of the plan, and then create metrics that relate both to the city's success criteria, but then also build metrics that relate to a developer's success criteria. In Urban, you create metrics in 3 steps. Step 1, and the one step that we'll spend the most time on today, is building out the flow of the metrics. So looking at the inputs and the outputs within the data manager itself. Step 2 is then being able to assign values to the parameters that we created in that first step. So these metrics allow us to create parameters, and these parameters can then be assigned values that may be unique to each individual space use type. And to give you an example of that really quickly, the residential space use types that we might use may each have different size units within them, depending on if we want luxury multifamily or market rate multifamily. And we can start to use the same metrics, but just change the underlying factors to represent different unit sizes. And this goes for retail and office, having different space use types represented that way. Step 3 is what you can do once you have the metrics built. We want to visualize them. So we can actually create a dashboard and assign different chart types to represent different metrics that we've created. So there are a few different types of metrics in Urban that I can first cover conceptually, and then take everyone through a few examples of creating these. So the first type are metrics based on net space area. So all metrics begin with the calculation of a total polygon area as you draw a new space use. For example, if you designate total office square feet out of the total area of the entire scenario, essentially you're saying that one space use type called office is going to just be calculating off of that area of which we consider office, rather than the area represented by the entire plan. The second type here, and probably the most common, are metrics to create new metrics. So this is the concept of using one metric as an input value to the next. And this means we can start to multiply, we can start to divide that area further. So for example, here we have residential units that can be multiplied by a parking ratio. So let's say, for example, purposes, 2 parking spots per unit is the kind of ratio we're looking at. And this results in a total parking required for all units as we start to draw our residential space use type. So these can be also very, very customized depending on the case. So another third type that I wanted to cover would be metrics to create totals. So it's common that in different uses like residential, office, and retail, they'll all have different parking requirements. So you can actually create a metric to sum the outputs together in a single place, allowing you to essentially get total parking across all of the maybe unique factors that contribute to the parking required per space use. The fourth and the final type that I'll conceptually explain would be metrics to create summaries. So we already know how to create total residential units, right? And we know how many there are. But with this type of metric, what we want to do is use a summary to drive a chart. And so we want to use that summary of residential affordability in order to have a chart that shows us what proportion is market rate and what other proportion is affordable rate in this example. So that summary of residential affordability would really be aimed at creating a distribution chart showing what's contributing to it, rather than us calculating a total number of units, for example. So now that you've kind of gotten introduced, let's say, to the types of metrics that can be made, you can start to build out the metrics that you need. What I'm going to do now is go into 4 examples shown here in the dashboard and talk through how they are put together. And I'm going to start with the first and the easiest, and probably the one that everyone here should start with as well. And then I'm going to move to more complex examples that, by the way, because these are explained in a slide and I'm not necessarily opening up the program yet, you're going to be able to go back, look at these slides, and repeat this on your own, actually, and probably tweak them a bit to suit the kind of metrics that you need to create. So the first one that I'm going to start with is creating a summary of use categories. And this is really useful when you have many different office types or many different retail types, different types generally, and there's a need to summarize these together under the same general broad category of use. So again, I gave that example earlier about having different residential space use types. Well, those can all become tagged essentially as residential within a metric as we present it. So let's dive into that. So you'll have many different types of space uses, and by establishing this major space use type category, we can actually create parameters that essentially tags each individual type to that broader category. So this means that, let's take retail, for example. Restaurant space use types, clothing store space use types will show up tagged under the same retail category. And this allows us to do a couple of different things. First of all, reuse a lot of metrics, and it reduces complexity as you're starting to build this out further. But also we can start to create summaries shown in the dashboard that I was showing earlier. And what we do in order to, create that summary at the end of the day, the summary of use program, we use a constant as the connection with a value of 1. So this is used when connecting each metric to the summary metric. And what it will do is actually weigh all the inputs the same. And the result is a chart showing the relative amounts of each broad category of use in the plan itself. Even though you might have 50 different space use types, it's always useful to kind of pare it back down to the critical 5 broad categories. The second example is going to build on that first one, and we can build out, in this case, a city success metric, total jobs. So calculating total jobs takes the metrics we just made, which is total retail square feet and total office square feet as inputs. And for the connections, what we're going to do is choose to divide the area and create unique parameter names, area per job. So what this does is it provides both the office and the retail space use types with a separate parameter to configure based on their jobs to area ratio. So also one last thing to note on this example, on total jobs, when we do have that end metric created, we chose to round it down. So it's an option. You're able to keep it as it is, round to the nearest, round up, round down. And so with this, we want to round down, meaning that we don't assign a job to a fraction of the area that's required for one job. All right, on the next example, we're going to take a look at calculating the residential unit types. So many of you here might already do this, but it's much easier to use a percent distribution of market rate versus affordable rate units as a parameter than try and go into the sketching environment and draw each individual building with each individual unit types kind of scattered throughout the building. Using the sketching tools shown earlier and building out a distribution like that doesn't give us an exact percentage, although you could do it that way too. So in this case, to break down the unit types, what we're going to do is apply a percentage split on the inputs, which is the total residential square footage. So the percent rate of each type is a parameter that can be edited later on too. You can actually test out how much affordable versus market rate units there are in a particular scenario, and obviously those will give different results in terms of their financial feasibility. So you can always go back and change those factors, and it gives you essentially a resulting total affordable square footage and a total market rate square footage. And with those two, as you can imagine, we divide it. And what we do is we divide it by their unit size. So market rate units and affordable units might have different sizes. These can be accounted for. And note on both of these, similar to the jobs one that I just did, on both of these metrics that calculates total units, we round down. So meaning we don't count a whole unit when only a fraction of the area exists as we're drawing. And then the last step is to add them up, to drive a chart in the dashboard. And this is being able to show the two types of units by that percentage split across the entire plan in that case. All right, and the final one that I'll break down today before showing a live demo of how to build one out yourself, if you haven't already, is a demo of the summary of financial performance. So this is a key success criteria for a developer. So you can start building this out by first creating a sum of the market value across all of our categories of use that we started out with today. This can be defined by multiplying value per square foot, or for residential, it can also be value per unit rather than just value per square foot. You might use one for residential per unit and then use per square foot for office and retail, for example. Both are possible. So in addition to the total market value, we'd need to create total developer construction cost. This too can be summed up either as cost per square foot or cost per residential unit, like you see here. And in order to take into account local government subsidies that might be applied to, at least in this example, to the affordable units or the amenities that might be things such as parks, we can create a third metric, which is the total city cost or local government subsidies. And we can actually assign a parameter here of percent city share of cost to each of these input metrics. So in this case, depending on the space use type, we can control how much of the subsidy is applied to the cost of building, for example, an affordable unit. That way, in the final summary of financial performance, we can represent both the total market value and subsidies as positive contributions. And we do this by connecting them to the summary using a constant with a positive value of 1. So it's basically taking the output value of the market total market value, and the output of the total city cost and subsidies. And it's multiplying that by 1, giving it a positive input to the summary. The next step would also be to connect the total developer construction cost to the summary, and we do that by connecting it with a constant with a value of -1. -1 is used to subtract the cost from the overall sum, which is the value. And so in the final summary of financial performance, we get the value and the subsidies minus the cost. So then we can actually use that final summary of financial performance in a dashboard, similar to the one that I was showing right here. So I hope the 4 examples we reviewed today would be helpful to you as you start to imagine you're creating your own metrics. I know I'll now show you how it works and how it looks with a live demo. But keep in mind, all of these examples that I've shown you today is also going to be in the example that we can provide out at the end. So for this last demo, what I'll do is I'll create a few metrics. And to do this, I will click Configure to open up the plan's overall settings. And you'll notice a few tabs at the top that allow you to change the sharing settings, which we covered already. You're able to manage the data within the plan. And then finally, at the very end, there's the Metrics tab. So we'll show the metrics here that we've already pre-programmed. It's quite extensive, and you can explore it with the tools to zoom in and out, to frame it to the view. And what I'm going to do is actually walk through an example that we covered earlier. So if we start with net space area, it gives us residential square feet, which then is divided by percentage into affordable and market rate square feet, which is then divided down into the unit size using that unit size parameter to give us the total number of units. So everything in this flow can be opened up and edited. So here you can see we used a round down on the value for this metric because you can't have a fraction of a unit. And what I'm going to do now is show you how to add a new metric. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to add one by clicking the Add button at the top. And we'll create something that we didn't do yet. We'll do total local purchasing power. And we're going to drive it off the units, for example. So no need to change the unit type or the rounding. And then after you click OK, it'll automatically appear at the top until you connect that metric up with the other metrics, giving it an input. So existing metrics can power new metrics, and by connecting them, what you're determining is the new input that metric gets. So for local purchasing power, we'll need to connect it to our residential units. And first we'll do market rate units. So this will cause the flow to shuffle a little bit. It's actually going to go into the logical place in the overall dependency graph. So we'll probably need to scroll down to the bottom, and it's in the graph there, next to the residential. So by clicking on the connection point, you can edit that connection, and here is where we choose how to name our parameter. And the name of the parameter, we'll choose estimated disposable income. And then I mentioned earlier on, it's probably good to keep this named for friendly searching. So in this case, I'm going to just put market rate units at the end so that we can pull it up later if we're looking for market rate unit parameters. So keep in mind the naming convention is useful. I'll show you why in a second. I'm going to do the same here for the affordable rate units. I'm going to just speed it up a bit. It's the same process of connecting the affordable rate units to the total local purchasing power, and the result of which will be taking both types of units and multiplying them by the disposable income that is then summed together to give us the total local purchasing power. So now we just need to add the parameter to our residential space use type, because that's the one that uses the units. And you can view all the space use types here. In this case, we'll open up the residential one, add 20K for market rate units, and let's say half for affordable units, just example purposes. But now if we go back to our plan, we can actually open up and look at the dashboard again. So back in our plan, we've added the new metric. We've added the parameter on the residential, which is all the yellow in our viewport here. And we can actually go down and find the new metric. So when you add new metrics, they'll be added to the bottom, initially to the bottom of the dashboard list. This can be configured so you have the ability to adjust the visibility of all metrics, add icons, choose a type of visualization of the chart that you wanted. You can always drag it up higher in the order of the dashboard. So overall, as summary, this might have seemed like a lot, but you can always rewatch this demo, and there's also a lot of great resources that we covered so far that helps you get started. There's also one particular blog that I would recommend taking a look at if you want to go in and try this for the very first time. If you're coming to this webinar having very little knowledge about Urban, then this blog is probably one of the best resources to get going. It uses the example I was just showing there. And yeah, it specifically covers metrics, and it should give you a good starting place. And then you can come back to the demo recording when you're ready to start building out a financial model. With that, I wanted to hand it back over to my colleague, Robin, to give us a summary and cover some important resources. And I'll hand it back over to you, Robin. Thanks.
Thank you, Brooks, and thank you for demoing capacity metrics. So I want to now talk about the steps to get started with Urban and how you can replicate this effort in your own community or your own Urban model. So to summarize, in this webinar, we looked at how Urban can provide a more data-driven approach to planning. Tools like Urban can be used to address these past transportation decisions that fractured, displaced, and segregated communities. We can then configure our capacity metrics in Urban to ensure that our new plan for these areas is providing the resources necessary to help reconnect previously disconnected communities. All right, so everyone on the call can access and explore the plan that Brooks has shown in today's webinar. We have a public copy of this model and the plan that you can access with your own Urban license or request a free trial. We're going to put links in the chat now to request the free trial and also the link to the Oakland plan that Brooks was using. Do remember though, you will have to save this plan as a duplicate so you can have your own version to edit, which is what this video is showing. And we would also like to announce our next webinar on March 16th. So this webinar will cover new features from the February 2022 release of Urban, which is happening in about 2 weeks. So as you might know, ArcGIS Urban releases 3 new feature updates a year, and the next one is in February. So if you would like to stay up to date on the new features of Urban, please feel free to register for this next Urban webinar. And we'll also put the link in the chat to register as well. So we have a plethora of resources on ArcGIS Urban for you to reference, whether you're going through your free trial or would like to learn more about Urban's capabilities in general. These will be provided in a follow-up email as well for you to explore. All right, so that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. We're now going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. So there is a chat in GoToWebinar on your panel, as well as a question option. So feel free to use either, and we'll monitor those and answer questions in the remaining time we have.
Awesome. So some questions have come in. We can go ahead and start with the first one. Do any of the metrics shown come out of the box, or are they all customized?
Yeah, I can probably take that one. So the metrics that we've shown here on the example that we covered today is just an example. We actually customized them for the competition that happened just last month. And so they're very much oriented towards development feasibility. But if you do need metrics out of the box, there are some that you can start with. We have a default set. And also, I did want to mention as well that in the release coming up in 2 weeks, we're also releasing a new capability that I can maybe hint at here, which is being able to create a new Urban with based on an existing template that you would have. So if you want to take the example we had today and basically use that to create your own existing conditions model, essentially, you can do that. And I'd recommend joining the webinar coming up to learn more about how to do that.
Awesome. We can go ahead with the next question too. How long will the example be available?
Yeah, sure. I can maybe take that one. The example is going to be available for the next couple months, I would say, at least. So I wouldn't necessarily wait. When you make the duplicate, you also have the option to check a box and then send it to an existing urban that you might have. So you can always do that. But yeah, once that duplicate of the example is made, then it's basically owned by you. It's on your organization. So yeah, it should be available for some time. But if not, for whatever reason it goes down, just send us an email.
Sure. Okay, awesome. And the next question is, can the metrics be exported?
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that. So the metrics can be exported. There is the option to download the capacity metrics for your scenarios as an Excel file. And when you click the download button in the Urban interface, it will show the capacity metrics for each scenario. So if you created multiple scenarios with different building densities, let's say, you can compare those scenarios against the same metrics and see how they perform and compare against each other.
Cool. Okay, next question. Can Urban export to Rhino or SketchUp?
Yeah, it's a question we get all the time. So when it comes to exporting from Urban, that's going from our ArcGIS online account to basically desktop. So we have a connection between Urban and CityEngine, which I would recommend using. It allows you to basically take an entire scenario into CityEngine. If you're not familiar with CityEngine, it's a desktop tool which does a lot of the kind of procedural modeling that you can do in Urban. But what it allows you to do is take the model that you've brought into CityEngine, export it as a lot of 3D interchange formats like FBX, OBJ, Collada, so DAE. If you didn't want to go through CityEngine, which honestly is the easiest route to get all the 3D out, if you wanted to just export from the web, you can do that by going to the item that it creates in the background. And you can actually export an entire plan scenario as a web scene, and then download that as KML and shapefile, which I believe both Rhino and SketchUp. Rhino might need a plugin, but they both should be able to read KML and shape.
Awesome. Also, can metrics be exported per building?
Yeah, I can address that. So yeah, they definitely can. So as Brooks mentioned, for exporting urban scenarios from Urban to Rhino, he mentioned the ability to export your scenario design, the buildings that you made, into a web scene. And you can export your scenario as a web scene. And when you open up that web scene in ArcGIS Online and Scene Viewer, you'll be able to see those metrics for the particular building stored in the attributes of that building. And so all of the capacity metrics that you've created in your dashboard will also show the individual values for that building when you select it.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because when you do export it to WebScene, all of the attributes are baked in there. So if you then download it as KML or shape for Rhino, you can actually take those attributes with you. Any other questions coming through?
Yep. So there are a few other questions that are coming through. One, how was the imagery and / building base map visualization created?
Yeah, that's a great question. Robin, you want to take that?
Yeah, so the imagery that Brooks was showing in the Oakland plan was the same that we showed of the flyover over the highways. That was provided by our business partner Nearmap, and it was actually a 3D mesh that we're able to integrate to be part of our satellite-based map in Urban. And it works the same way as traditional schematic 3D building-based maps look like. So if you've seen other urban models with schematic-based maps, which are those white buildings, the mesh-based maps work the exact same way. So you can flatten them, as Brooke showed, and work with them in the scenario plan mode with better context because they now have textures, so you can better see what's around the building. But yes,
Yeah,
it's provided by.
If I just add anything else, it would be that Nearmap has on their website a coverage map. So I guess in the past, a mesh like that would have had to be tasked, like you would have had to have a company come out and fly it, basically in an airplane. But the interesting thing about what Nearmap has is they have a library of these mesh data sets that you're able to basically purchase once. And then if you're wanting an update, then you get an annual update. I think some of the larger cities of the US get updates multiple times a year. But generally, I think it's up to like 80 or 90% of the population of the US, Canada, and Australia is covered at the moment. So you don't have to wait, essentially. The mesh data already exists. So it's a really nice data set and a great source for that.
Awesome. Okay, the next question is, how do you delete the scenarios that you don't want?
Oh, that's an easy question. I'll take that. So whenever you're looking at Urban and you see the scenarios at the top of the viewport, you'll always see a little button at the very right of the scenario names. There's 3 little dots and ellipses, and you click that. That lets you edit all the existing scenarios. So it's where you go to create a new one. It's where you go to reorder them. It's also where you can go and delete them if you need to. Something to keep in mind also is that when you create scenarios and when you go back and edit them, you can check a box to make sure that only you can edit that particular scenario. Even if you've added your colleagues to the plan in Urban, you can control the editing privileges on your individual scenario. So if Robin creates a scenario and she checks that box that only she can edit it, I'm not going to be able to edit it, but I'm going to be able to go in there and create a new scenario based off that scenario, and that way it creates a copy essentially. But we've built in a lot of tools to help manage those scenarios, and one of them is to be able to delete them.
Cool. Okay, the next question is the affordability summary tied to the space use type, or how is that incorporated with the metrics?
Yeah, I can take that. So when we covered that example for splitting out from a general category of residential square footage that basically gets tagged, right? You take the net square footage of all the space that you've drawn with the residential multifamily or other residential space use types. As long as you tag that to basically factor up into that broad category, you're able to then use that as a source to then either through a percentage split or a known constant. You can also just use a constant instead of a parameter. You can basically have that affordability summary tied either to the metric through a constant or unique to the space use type that you're drawing. So in the example that we provided you here, you'll notice that there's only one residential multifamily space use type. You can copy that. So just like you would copy and delete scenarios, you can copy and delete space use types. So I could take that one, I could copy it, duplicate it essentially, rename it. So instead of multifamily, I could say fancy townhomes. So that's a different type of multifamily, but generally with fancy townhomes, I can use a different percentage break in the affordability versus market rate parameter. So just because we've designed the metrics to work, generally, it doesn't mean it can't be specific to the individual space use type. Really, that's the job of the parameter, the factors that you're using, such as the percent split or the unit size or the value, cost. All of these are per space use type, but utilizing the overall structure of the metrics that you've coded into the system with the visual editor that we saw.
Well, okay. Next question. How do you relate new space used to market demand?
Yeah, that's a interesting question. So there is actually a metric in the example. We didn't cover it. You might have seen it in the dashboards that we had up on a slide, but we did put in there an absorption rate. And so you can put that in there as a factor on an individual space use type. So just like you would decide what the unit size is, or the percent split, or the value of a particular space use type, you can also factor in the annual absorption rate, and then you can use a metric as a decimal value, essentially saying how much is absorbed over a single year. And so if it's below 1, then it's within the annual absorption, or if it's above, say, 1.5, then it's a year and a half. So you can actually build a metric for absorption rate. So that's how I would recommend tying it to the local market demand once you know what the absorption rate is for the local market.
Cool. Okay, next question. How do you make a copy of the urban model so that the original model is not affected?
You want to take that, Robin?
Yeah, so that would be one of the new features coming out in February release, right, Brooks? The ability to take a copy of the
For the
model and
entire.
preserve the metric.
Yeah, but you're always able to download a geodatabase from where it's stored in the ArcGIS account. So you're always able to take down a copy.
Yep, and additionally, so when we were talking about the public Oakland plan that you can save as your own plan and start working on, there's also the option to take a plan from one urban model and put it into another urban model. So that's a way that you can preserve the model you're taking data from into a new urban model as well.
Yeah, here I can put up the slide again. But it's important to note, like, the example that we provide is going to be a plan, and it's not necessarily the entire urban model. It's just the one plan within it. And so that's actually what you can save as a duplicate. And so it's pretty straightforward, being able to save a copy, and then you can work on it a bit.
Awesome. The next question is there any way for public community outreach in this program, such as a way for stakeholders to provide feedback directly through the program?
Yeah, that's changing a little bit in the February release. We have a function called discussions. So if you remember, we added both Robin and Kira to the plan that I had. I shared it with them. And by clicking the share, what you're also able to enable is a tab up at the top when you're in the editor. It's a little speech bubble. You probably saw it up in the top right corner. That's the discussions tab, and you're able to basically have multiple different threads, groups, like you would in Teams or whatever chat program you use at work. Generally, that's how you work internally, but we're also allowing the plan itself to be made public, and then you can turn on public feedback. So someone who might not have any idea what ArcGIS is can go to the URL, see the plan. Obviously, it's not going to be editable, and you probably want to clean it up a bit, make sure only the good scenarios are left. But generally, turning on public feedback will then enable that discussions to happen for anonymous users, we say. So those users who aren't logged in would still be able to comment.
Yep. And not only do they not have to be logged in, but they don't even necessarily have to have an account at all to access a public urban model and plan to comment.
Awesome, guys. So this is going to be the last question, and we'll try to contact everybody else with the answers to the rest of the questions that we've been asked. But in editor mode of plans and projects, will there be available pop-ups windows for contextual layers?
Yeah, I didn't demonstrate that, but yeah, when you open a plan for the first time, you actually have this card, which gives you information about it. You might have seen it. But when that card's open, you actually have the ability to click on the layers and get pop-ups. And so the pop-up will be depending on how that layer's been set up in a web scene. So web scene is a fancy name for a 3D map in the ArcGIS environment. So what you do is if you want context layers, you drop them all into a single web scene. Let's call it like the one place to store all your layers, and then you add that as one web scene for your plan as context. And so what that allows you to do is take any layer that you drop into that context web scene into Urban, and that goes for all the pop-ups and the visibility. And if you have certain layers with transparency, that sort of thing, it'll all carry over from that context web scene. And I should also mention that the scenarios themselves can have context web scenes too. So keep that in mind. There's sort of the plan itself overall. So across all scenarios, you have context layers, but then for certain scenarios, you might have additional context layers.
Awesome. Okay, I think that's pretty much all we have time for with questions. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, well then, on behalf of the whole team, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of the week.